Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this Game Industry Insight, a look behind the scenes at game development. And be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future video topics. Oh boy, everybody. It seems like every day I'm trying to do a easy critical thought or write a post for the site that there's news that's sidelining it. And for today's piece, it has to do with Alan Wake. One of my favorite games from Remedy Entertainment, and I'm still sad that we didn't see a sequel, and it looks like we won't be seeing one in the future. The news that broke today is that Alan Wake is going to be removed from digital stores in a few days. I believe I'm recording this on Friday the 12th. I believe by Sunday the 14th of May, the game is going to be removed. And the reason has to do with the licensed music. And I know we have spoken about that one in the past. But this is giving me the inspiration to once again give another talk and plea to raise concern and awareness about video game preservation. For longtime fans of Game Wisdom, you know how I feel about the topic. And I think that, like I've said before, that there are some major problems with the industry and their thoughts on it that we need to correct sooner than later. Now, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, video game preservation is simply the act of making sure that video games are preserved and made available for years beyond their shelf life. This can be via emulators, updating the code, and even just going into it and altering the code or restoring it for modern audiences, just similar to what GOG does. Now, while this all sounds fine and wonderful, there are major hurdles that are getting in the way. The first one has to do with the technology itself. One of the things about older video games, especially pre-2000, is that there wasn't any real standards. Many video games, especially the console market variety, were basically built on customized engines. Now, of course, today, for many indie fans, you of course have seen a whole lot of games being made out of stuff like Unity, Game Maker, Unreal, and the like. But back then, basically games were being built with whatever the designers could come up with. And while this certainly got those games working, it has made it a nightmare to preserve them. Because the problem is every different engine or every alteration requires more work on the emulation side in order to get that game running properly. Now, speaking of emulation, the one thing I was reading this article about this last year, but basically in whatever the technical specifications for that game or that hardware, to emulate that inside a computer or another machine requires hardware that is several times more powerful. Now, when we're talking about 8-bit games or 8K, I think there's probably even smaller than that, we talk Atari, computers today can run those reasonably well. But when we start getting to the N64, GameCube, PlayStation 2 era, it becomes a lot harder. And it becomes a lot more limiting depending upon what kind of hardware the person has who's trying to run the emulator. Now, the other part about this in terms of technical side, there's the obvious one, trying to get the parts and the original copies working. As we've seen, when it comes to major hardware life cycles, once the system is done, there will come a point where the platform manufacturer will discontinue manufacturing. We've seen this with PlayStation 1, N64, GameCube, again, you name the platform that's not recent, and it's probably not being made anymore. What that immediately does is it creates a limited availability for these hardware, or for this hardware and for the parts needed to fix them. I spoke to, I forget his name, I'm afraid, but he runs a video game museum out on the West Coast. And when we spoke about this on the podcast, I think it was about 2 years ago, he talked about how they have basically an entire basement full of Sega Genesis, Super Nintendos, NESs, Ataris, and the like, in order to properly maintain the stuff that's being displayed at the museum. Whether it is to have spare parts if something breaks, or to just simply take that system, bring it upstairs, and use it that way. But the point is, this is a band-aid fix. Eventually, all that hardware is going to stop working. One of the things that I've talked about before and I want to bring up here is the fact that when it comes to awareness for preserving items, be them TV shows, comic books, cars, movies, video games, and the like, no one thinks about this during the actual heyday. For instance, when we're talking about, action comics back in the 50s, 60s, I'm pretty sure Marvel and DC weren't thinking about how someone's going to read this 60 years from now. And when I spoke with a game designer, the creator of Voodoo Vince, Clayton, I forget, I'm going to butcher his last name, so I'm not going to try and pronounce it. We talked about the oddity that it is when it comes to video games, and the fact that it's easier to watch a movie that's 100 years old today than it is to play a video game that's at least 20 years old. And that takes me to the other part, and kind of leads in from this last point, consumer awareness. Chances are, for the vast majority of you watching this, although depending upon my outreach, that may not be true with this audience, but there's a lot of people who simply don't care about preserving video games. A lot of consumers treat video games like any other hardware product. When the new version comes out, you throw out or you sell the old version, because the new hotness, basically. But as we have certainly discussed, there is certainly art when it comes to video games, especially with classic games, as evident by the huge support and interest that GOG has gotten. I've said this before, but they just don't make them like that anymore, for good and for ill. And it's important to be able to preserve these games, not only to study them, but to show consumers and people outside the industry essentially our history of what it means to play and make video games. Like we've talked about, there are a lot of older games that really have stood the test of time, be it for being so good or simply for being so unique. XCOM, Star Control 2, hell, we could even say the original Mario games and Zelda and whatnot. But for a lot of people, there still hasn't been enough push yet to say that the market wants these games to be preserved. Now, the other part about this, and this is the big one, has to do with the industry itself. And this is probably the hardest nut to crack when it comes to game preservation. We have seen time and time again that the industry, for the most part, simply doesn't care about preserving games. Now, we've seen some rare examples or some rare exceptions such as Nintendo, but as we've talked about before, you can't rely on one company or the company that's making this stuff to be the sole owner or the sole holder of preserving it, because there's chances are there will be a time when that's no longer valid. For instance, as we saw over the last holiday season with the rush for the NES Classic Edition, Nintendo vastly underestimated how much interest there is, and they feel like they're not going to make it anymore. Now, of course, Nintendo has the virtual consoles, but the question is, how long are they going to really maintain that? The same goes for what we see on PSN or XBLA with some of their older games. With each new platform, it's only a matter of time of how long they can estimate to hold things. And the phone is ringing, so I will take a quick break and I will be right back. Sorry about that, everybody, but getting back to our topic, you can't rely on just one platform or one person to maintain and hold these games. Because, like we've said, it's only a matter of time before things are going to stop. Like we saw with the PlayStation. As Sony upgraded the hardware support between the PlayStation 1, 2, 3, and so on, they found that it was becoming increasingly harder to keep these systems backwards compatible with each other. Same goes for Nintendo. Obviously, the Wii and the Wii U were backwards compatible, but it goes without saying that with the Nintendo Switch being cartridge-based, that you're not going to be able to fit a Wii U disc onto the Nintendo Switch. And therein lies one of the major issues. That at some point, it's very easy, if you just keep it to the company, it's very easy for them to stop supporting it. And the big other example this week that we talked about the other day is with Hitman 2016 and IO Interactive no longer being supported by Square Enix. Now, at this point, like I said yesterday, that the future of the series in the company is up in the air at the moment. But here's another big point. In 5 years from now, are we still going to be able to play Hitman 2016? If you remember, it was designed as a games as a service model or long-term support with patches and continued development over the year after its release. But in order for that to be maintained and kept up to date, the servers for that game have to be maintained. If Square Enix decides to drop those servers for whatever reason, people aren't going to be able to get the latest version of the game, and a lot of that content's going to be lost. As we've talked about with companies like EA, who are famous for shutting down servers, this can just outright kill a game, especially with titles that are designed as with day one patches or continuous support. With No Man's Sky, for instance, that has seen a whole lot of work over the months following its release, if Sony decides to just say screw it and turn those servers off, that game is done, because no one will be able to download those patches anymore and maintain those games. And as we've said, the industry as a whole is terrible when it comes to coming together for major issues like this. And like I said at the start, these are discussions that we should be having sooner than later. And one last point that I almost forgot about, but to just bring up quickly here, there's of course the copyright issue. And my goodness, copyright laws and licensing, that's easily another topic or two to talk about. But with Alan Wake, for instance, that's the reason why the game is being taken off. Because the licensing for the music has ran out, and since they can't get it back, they can't legally sell the game anymore. But of course, this raises the big problem. Because video games have to be patched and continuous support to be maintained, that doesn't mesh with copyright law when it comes to licensing music. When it comes to licensing content like this, be it music, art, vocals, stuff like that, you are given a limited time license for that IP. We talked about this before. If I decide, if in some grand miracle I get the license to make Mickey Mouse hats, something like that, I don't own that license forever. I'm given a limited number of time that I can work on that, and that I can reasonably ship it and sell it to stores. Once I've gone over my limit, or I've gone past that time, I legally cannot make any more of that item without renegotiating or renewing that license. So, for instance, let's say I make the item, I sell it, and then I realize, let's say a year down the line, that there was a defect and the hats are falling apart. If I want to make another version or create like a fulfillment for fixed versions of that item, because I don't have the hat license anymore, the Mickey Mouse license, I can't do that anymore. And of course, that leaves the consumer SOL. Just like with the Grand Theft Auto issue, with them basically removing songs from the game. And that, my friends, is a very interesting topic, and I think I know the answer to this one, but I won't ask it here. Once someone has bought a copy of the game, be it digital or physical, is that copy now immune to licensing? Like, was it within their right, the music holders, to take those songs out of Grand Theft Auto 4, and I'm going to assume it's going to happen to Grand Theft Auto 5 at some point. But let me know in the comments below. But to wrap things up, this is not an easy topic to talk about, because again, most people are not thinking about this. But it's becoming harder and harder to have these talks and to set things up to preserve these games. The PlayStation 1 should not be considered this ancient mythical platform by now, far less the Super Nintendo or the NES. And I do think there should be updates to copyright laws when it comes to supporting these games. Again, video games are different from other mediums because we have both the product and the hardware that are required to run it. And then, as we talked about, there's also the technical limitations of different engines and the options that go with it. But I've said this before and I'll say it again, I would love for there to be a console or a non-PC version of GOG out there. Again, that is very much a pipe dream, but it's something that I really hope we look into, or we start looking into some serious options when it comes to preserving these games. For those of you watching this right now, do you have any suggestions or ideas about how we can make these games easier to preserve, or to start setting into motion the act of guaranteeing that we can play these games in 10, 20, 30 years down the line? Again, we're not going to be solving this today, but I hope you enjoyed this industry insight. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and check back daily for more great discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And if there's anyone who does like emulation, or has an interest or worked with preserving video games and would like to talk to me, either live or recorded, please get in touch with me, because I would love to talk more about this topic with you. But until tomorrow, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GW for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.